All right, I think we're going to get it started before we get any further behind schedule. Our final panelist is here and will be joining us shortly. Just say a couple of quick words by way of introduction. I'm Jacques Delisle. I'm the director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Institute and also professor of law and political science at the University of Pennsylvania. It gives me great pleasure to be back here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and to thank especially Shihoko Goto, my partner in crime, in organizing this latest in a series of joint programs that we've run with the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. Shihoko will be moderating the second panel. We have a lot on our agenda today. So I don't want to take any more time away from our panelists. I'll just do very brief introductions, then say a couple of words to frame what we're going to be talking about. So in the order in which they will be speaking to you, and we will leave time for Q&A and back and forth, but the order of initial presentations will first be Mike Pillsbury, who's Senior Fellow and Director for Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute. He's held a number of interesting positions over the years, including Assistant Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Planning. Back in the days of the Reagan Doctrine, has worked at the RAND Corporation, a number of other important undertakings in the China policy world. After Mike, we will have David Dollar, who's a senior fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings and has worked in the World Bank, the U.S. Treasury Department, and a variety of other things having to do with the Chinese and broader Asian economy. Then third, with the home court advantage, is Meg Lunziger, who is a public policy fellow here at the Wilson Center and was the United States Executive Director on the International Monetary Fund's Executive Board and also worked as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade and Investment in the Treasury Department. And to my immediate right is somebody I had the pleasure of being on a panel with not too long ago up in Cambridge and was delighted that he would join us for this panel today. It's Bradford Ward. Brad is a partner at King & Spalding. Works on a variety of trade remedy matters and other trade strategy issues. And before going into private practice with King & Spalding, he spent a good deal of time as the Deputy General Counsel in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and was also Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Monitoring and Enforcement. So as that brief sketch, and there's more information in your programs, tells you we've really got kind of an all-star lineup to deal with the issue of the U.S.-China trade conflict, some would say trade war, and where it's likely to head and what it means. So I'm first going to turn it over to Mike to offer his thoughts.
Thank you, Jock, and thank you for sending me some of your recent articles, which I want to commend to everybody. Trade is part of a much larger issue that's been defined, I think, across this political spectrum as China joining the world order, sometimes referred to as the liberal world order. And there can be lots of debates, but Jacques' articles deal with the concept of whether Chinese views of international law and the world order differ from other Western views. And I think he comes out basically saying there are differences, important differences. So trade policy, it seems to me, is part of a much larger issue that goes across presidents, across administrations, of what are we dealing with in terms of China's joining and assisting what used to be called becoming a stakeholder in the global world order. And views vary even within China on that. And I want to say a few words about the debate in China because it's been introduced by our wonderful U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Bob Lighthizer in his congressional testimony to House Ways and Means and to Senate Finance Committee not too long ago when he was being asked by the congressional oversight committees on trade to define the trade talks and what has happened so far. He very carefully continued the administration's policy of secrecy toward the details of the trade talks. We have a rather humorous exchange going on indirectly about just the number of pages in the agreement. Some said 120, then some said 140. Larry Kudlow said it's either 120 or 140. More recently, it's risen to 150. There was some talk about chapters. Then there was going to be some memorandum of understanding. Everybody knows from the cameras what happened when the president personally got involved. So the contents of the agreement remain secret, which I think is a very good thing. I don't think we want to embarrass either ourselves or the Chinese negotiating side by gloating over concessions, by focusing on a kind of one-sided interpretation, we won, you lost. This is the worst thing to do in the final phase or in the end game of a negotiation. And if you look at both the Chinese materials I quote in my book, The 100-Year Marathon, and Henry Kissinger also quotes this concept of sure, S-H-I in English, fourth tone, sure. It actually means to exploit opportunities quickly when something arises. And in both President Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and in quite a few Chinese books that I cite, Dr. Kissinger applies it to military strategy in China. When the sure arrives, you must move quickly. This is the end game of a negotiation. So yes, a lot of administration spokesmen have said quite accurately, I believe, that we're 90% of the way there. And then, of course, the stock market goes up. But then another commentator will say, well, there are a few issues left. And then the stock market goes down. So our markets are having a difficult time, as are scholars, knowing what is the essence of this secret deal that the president fairly recently, and I agree with him, I think he's a very witty person. It's not, his wit and humor is not appreciated widely in Washington, but I appreciate it. He said, this is the granddaddy of them all. That means a trade agreement between the two largest economies. If we use World Bank numbers, we have 19 trillion for the U.S. and 12 trillion for China. If we use PPP, we'll get a little bit different numbers. But this is clearly the two largest economies in the world. And some of the descriptions of the agreement have included words like 2029. Some elements will last for 10 years. Some other descriptions have included 2025 or 2026. So this is a possible framework of trade stability between the two sides if they can reach an agreement on some fairly fundamental issues. To go back with what I mentioned, China joining the global world order. One issue, any one of you and all of us would be offended if someone said, Meg, you're a robber, you're a burglar, you're a thief, and I want you to join me in some talks to discuss how you're going to stop. Meg would surely say, no, I'm not. And I would say, yes, you are. Will you come to the talks? If tariffs were applied on Meg, something similar to tariffs, perhaps she would come to the talks, and perhaps they would be secret. But then there'd be the question of a confession. If our side insists on Meg confessing, the chances go down to almost zero, I would suspect, of a successful outcome. So putting aside allegations of wrongdoing may be an important part of the talks. Then having a mechanism by which we say, okay, Meg, you didn't steal, you're not a burglar, or let's not say you are anymore. In exchange, we'll have a 3-level court of appeals in which people who want to come in and complain can do so. You get a chance to respond, and then we're going to put tariffs on you, and please don't retaliate. And please sign here that you won't. I'm giving you a rough idea of the complexity of the concepts involved in the trade talks. So if the two sides can succeed, what we actually have is not only a 10-year framework of some stability in the trade relationship, but a built-in court of appeals that aggrieve companies perhaps on both sides, perhaps on the Chinese side, Steve Mnuchin has mentioned, and certainly on the American side, could seek justice, the original concept of the global world order. Now, there's many other issues in trade. One is the effect, our topic today, Jacques, is the effect on the region, the larger effects. If there's a point of view that I used to have, it's kind of called the G2 for short, that the US and China, these two great economies, share so much in common, they should be the G2 for global governance. And the others can kind of follow along whatever the US-China agreement is first. The other pole from that is what I call the new Cold War or Cold War 2.0, in which relations between the US and China deteriorate so quickly and so far that the Chinese have to reconsider their extremely small nuclear weapons program. Everybody in the Wilson Center is supposed to know China has almost no nuclear weapons. The numbers vary from 300 down to 260 in various journals like Federation of American Scientists. The United States, numbers vary, but we're in the same league as the Russians of 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 total, and then a certain number governed by treaties. The Chinese are disadvantaging themselves in the nuclear balance, which is the supreme way to measure the balance of power. In a new Cold War 2.0, this would be madness for China. They would need the military means to protect themselves. So, in my experience here in Washington, everybody falls, no exceptions. Everybody falls between the G2 and the new Cold War 2.0 along a rather complex spectrum. And I believe that is what's behind the trade agreement. Because if one is worked out successfully, if the enforcement mechanism starts to work, then we're looking much more toward a G2 kind of consensus about how U.S.-China relations will work. And this has enormous implications for European Union, Southeast Asia, Japan. It's a nightmare for many countries. India would be a good example. India's declined to support the Belt and Road Initiative. They won't attend the meetings. If they see a U.S.-China condominium for global governance, this leaves India alone and isolated unless it reassesses and changes its policy. So it also has implications if there's no agreement or the mechanism breaks down. It tends to reinforce the Cold War 2.0 people. And just in the last couple of sentences, Jacques, I don't want to go over my time, I believe there's a similar debate in China. The Politburo meets in secret. It just announced its economic assessment just a few days ago. But we don't have a Newsweek and a Time and a New York Times that can cover all the differences between Wang Huning and others on the standing committee. But we can see some examples of debate. A number of professors saying Xi Jinping made a mistake to be too assertive and to give up Deng Xiaoping's famous Tao Guang Yang Hui, to bide your time. We can see debate over the Constitution, the famous constitutionalist movement started about 10 years ago, that the Constitution should be above the party in court decisions. So we can see a debate in this wonderful document David Dollar, I suspect, worked on, I'm not sure, the World Bank NRDC joint report called China 2030 that advocates reducing subsidies, privatizing the large state-owned enterprises. It's almost the Trump agenda for China. The good China, what he calls the good China, is in the China 2030 study 7 years ago. So we can see this debate in China. It's also going to be influenced by the trade talks outcome. So is that pretty much the end of my time?
Just about to the minute. So thank you so much for that, giving us so much to chew on there. And it's an interesting flashback to around 2000, or 1999, 2000, when we saw the WTO negotiations going through. And it was very much a parallel discussion of will China making external commitments by joining the WTO push forward certain reforms at home. But I'm sure we'll get into that on the Q&A session. So let me pass it on to David.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacques. Great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the regional impact of the trade conflict. I'm a relative optimist, so I think we are close to a trade deal. That's what we hear from the two presidents. I think they have incentives to reach a deal. It may take a few more weeks, but I'm going to proceed on the assumption that there is a deal. And I think Mike made the important point that we don't know the details. Good negotiations are kept in secret. But I would argue that we have a good sense of the different components that are likely to be included. And the main point I want to make is that some of the likely components are probably good, even very good for the regional economy. And then some of the components are probably bad for the regional economy. So let me start out with what I think is good. That's really the set of structural issues over which we are negotiating. And I wasn't personally involved in the China 2030 because I had already left the World Bank to go to the U.S. Treasury, but it was my team essentially that did that work. So I feel some, I wouldn't say ownership.
It's a great study. It's a great report. It's online.
Thank you. But I think you're right that it points out a lot of the key structural issues, problems in China. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but my own favorite issue is it's a very dualistic economy with some sectors that are extremely open and competitive. That's why China is so successful. But they have a lot of sectors that are relatively closed. Automobiles is a good example, financial services, healthcare, data, telecom. There's a pretty long list. More services than manufacturing, but you find some industries from both sectors on that list. And a lot of that restriction is really about foreign direct investment into China. In the service sectors, it's very hard for say, the American firms to export into China if they can't invest there. In a lot of sectors, these restrictions require investors. They can be involved in China, but they have to be in joint ventures, and that's where you get the pressure to transfer your technology, and there are also issues of intellectual property rights protection. So I think there's pretty broad agreement about the issues, and I agree with the point that there are an important group of reformers in China who know this and who would like to reform the economy, and they actually welcome some of the external pressure to try to get China to agree to open up more markets. Now, the rumors are that China is willing to open up financial services, auto, they're talking about cloud computing, so I think there is potential to have some significant opening. Having said that, I would not expect it to be radical. China does do things gradually. I think they have been gradually opening up the economy, and the best prospect is they accelerate that somewhat, but I think it would be naive to think that there would be radical change. Now, any of this opening is going to benefit everybody. You're not going to open up to American firms. You're going to open up to foreign firms and imports. So the whole regional economy will benefit, and our partners would be very happy to see the U.S. make progress on market access. Japanese friends, other friends in the region, Australia, they would love to see China open up more. Now, the second point I want to make is that I think the U.S. focus on the bilateral trade imbalance is really misguided and not helpful. And that's where the main solution that's being discussed is Chinese commitment to make various purchases, buy more soybeans. I mean, the main big ticket items are likely to be soybeans, liquefied natural gas, autos, aircraft, semiconductors. And I think there's a problem with trying to negotiate big purchases like that. First, they are going to come from Chinese state enterprises, so that kind of reinforces the state part of the Chinese economy. But there's a danger that this is going to hurt our partners in Asia. So at the risk of oversimplification, if we think about China making some big purchases, I think it's worth thinking of two extreme possibilities and realities likely to be in the middle. One possibility is what I call inefficient reshuffling. So for example, in 2017, the U.S. exported $14 billion of soybeans to China and $7 billion to other countries. Brazil is the biggest trader in soybeans. They exported $22 billion to China. So it'd be easy for China to redirect its purchases from Brazil to the United States, okay? We might increase our exports to China by $7 billion. If Brazil then steps in and takes over our clients, nothing real will have happened. So that actually wouldn't be a very big problem, but it's what I call inefficient reshuffling. Presumably the current patterns are efficient, and so if you force firms to change, you're introducing a little bit of inefficiency. But in that case, it's not going to be very great in that example, but it's also not going to have any effect on the U.S. economy. So the other possibility, kind of at the other extreme, is the United States would like to increase its market share in all the products I just discussed. So we want to keep our clients and export more to China. That's necessarily going to impose losses on the countries that have competing products. So Australia will lose out in LNG, Brazil in soybeans, Japan and Europe on autos, European Union on aircraft, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea on semiconductors. And if it's a very big deal, we could be imposing some pretty significant losses on our partners. And so that's why there's a lot of nervousness around the region about what are going to be the different components of this deal. To what extent is it China opening up markets for all participants? To what extent are these bilateral purchase deals from the United States? Now, the last point I want to make is that probably this purchase program is not going to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. We can be pretty sure it won't affect the overall U.S. trade deficit. That's largely a macro phenomenon. But it probably won't have the effect on the bilateral trade balance that we think, okay? If you look at the last couple years, our imports from China are up 17% over the last 2 years. So as long as the U.S. economy is growing well, we Americans, we're likely to keep importing from China. And, unless there's a reactivation of the trade war, we're going to be importing a lot from China. So even if we sell some tens of billions of dollars of extra products, we're going to be importing tens of billions of dollars more. That's been the pattern of the last couple years. Our trade deficit with China is up $72 billion over the last 2 years. Economists like me, we don't really pay attention to bilateral trade balances, but if you're paying attention, that deficit has increased by $72 billion. It's extremely unlikely that that's going to get undone in the next few years. So the main point I'm trying to emphasize is that market opening in China, structural change, that's going to be good for the regional economy and for our partners. Negotiated trade purchases, if they're very large scale, that has a danger of imposing costs on our various partners. And so naturally, that's unpopular around Asia. And then the last point I would make following on what was my third point, that probably the U.S. trade balance is not going to move in the direction that's desired. There's a very good chance that the U.S. will be disappointed in the outcome of the trade deal. I guess I'm skeptical. We're going to hear from others. I'm skeptical there can be much of an enforcement mechanism in this kind of bilateral deal. So as that trade imbalance moves in the wrong direction, there's a good chance the U.S. will be disappointed and that at some point, some or all of this deal will fall apart. And I think that's a very common worry around Asia. And it fits nicely with Mike's talk about G2 versus New Cold War. Even if you get some kind of agreement between China and the U.S. in the next couple of months or weeks, what I hear from the business community is a lack of confidence that that agreement is likely to stick. So the threat of a new Cold War is probably going to be hanging over us for the foreseeable future. And just that uncertainty reduces trade and investment. So I think there's a risk that this is going to be bad for the regional economy. But I'll finish by going back to where I started. The potential is for some of this to be very good for the regional economy to the extent that we're negotiating, getting real commitments from China's reformers to accelerate their opening, improve intellectual property rights protection. All the issues being discussed are real issues, and our partners around Asia would love to see progress on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Meg?
Thank you very much, Jacques, and I agree with some of what David has said and Mike. I'm probably a little bit less of an optimist than David is. And in part, it comes from long experience, and I have worked closely with Chinese colleagues over the years. I was part of the negotiating team for China's entry into the WTO, handling the financial services side when I was at Treasury. And just to give you one example of how things like that can support reformers, several years later, when I was at the IMF then, I was in a meeting with some Chinese colleagues and some U.S. officials, and the Chinese were saying, oh, we have to reform our financial sector because of our WTO commitments. And I was so gratified because we had brought them in and they felt they needed to meet these certain standards. So with that said, there's still a lot of issues. It has not been an easy path down towards that reform. But keeping an eye on the clock, I just wanted to touch on a few things, and some of it will go a little bit beyond trade, but trying to get the broader context of China, the region, the U.S. role. I'll just touch briefly on some of the trade issues. The others have brought them up, but I also want to talk about debt development, foreign investment, and global standard setting. So just to go through it quickly, this administration seems in the U.S. to be focused on fair trade, and I think that's something everybody supports. Trade should be fair, it should be a level competitive market out there, and so if you produce something well, efficiently, you've got a good price, you should be able to sell. And that then gets at concerns about subsidies. Now, what has frustrated me the last couple of years is the U.S. has walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And of course, those countries have gone on their own to form the agreement, and we're already seeing trade expanding among countries in Asia and the U.S. being cut out. So I think that has hurt the U.S. a bit. The other thing is, as David was just saying, the deal with China probably will cement the role of state-owned enterprises because they'll be the ones the government can direct to go buy more airplanes or oil or LNG or whatever it may be. And so this is one of the things the U.S. has been, and everybody else in the World Bank, the IMF, all other countries, trying to push to reduce the role of state-owned enterprises, which, of course, in the long run should be in China's benefit, too, because it'll be a more dynamic private sector providing jobs and development. But the U.S., I'm afraid, is going to be cementing that role of SOEs a little bit longer. And then when I look at a lot of the trade issues, the concerns the U.S. has are the same concerns many other countries had, whether in Asia, Japan, Korea, others, Australia, or in Europe or Canada. And we're not using the WTO. The U.S. is very frustrated with the WTO. I understand that. The WTO is not an easy organization, but it is an organization with binding rules in it and mechanisms for pursuing problems. And I think the U.S. should come back and try and work constructively to make it more effective. And then you can use the WTO to band together when you have concerns, whether it's about Chinese subsidies or some other practice. So that's the bit on trade for now. I mean, there's a lot more I'm sure we'll come back to. I want to talk about debt a bit in a number of countries because many of the smaller developing countries, whether in Asia, and of course you've seen stories about Africa as well, are increasing their levels of debt again. Government debt, and even in some countries that have a bit of a private sector growing, private sector debt. And this is getting to be a little bit worrisome because, of course, these countries have to repay that debt in terms of foreign exchange, dollars or yen or euros or maybe Chinese yuan. And they may not be earning enough in terms of exports, rapid development to be able to do that. Then these countries are going to be turning back to the World Bank, the IMF, and other creditors for help on this. So what has encouraged, helped develop this, increases debt? Of course, part of it is the Belt and Road Initiative with all these different multiplicity of entities in China participating in Belt and Road and lending or investing, which really has more the form of loans in various countries. You've all seen the stories about the port facility in Sri Lanka that they had to turn over to the Chinese investor, so to speak. But you've seen Malaysia push back, concerns now in Pakistan, the other countries as well, Philippines raising concerns. So these are exactly the kind of issues that the U.S. has concerns about, debt in these countries. And you've seen how a number of members of Congress sent a letter to Secretary Mnuchin. If there's an IMF program in Pakistan, make sure that that money doesn't go right back to repay China. And so here's an opportunity for us to work with other countries to try and strengthen the rules, the transparency, especially on debt statistics. How much is China lending? On what terms? And frankly, the reformers in China would like that too. Those at the center, probably in the People's Bank and the finance ministry, that understand very well when countries get in trouble, all the other creditors around the world have to help them work it out. They'd like to know what their own entities are lending as part of Belt and Road and other initiatives. And those other agencies don't really want to tell. They want to keep it private. They want to keep the terms able to work out whatever deal they may need to, whether it's taking over a port in Sri Lanka or, a permanent stream of oil or commodities coming from that country. So development. This is one thing all countries in the region are looking for: more infrastructure investment. The U.S., we'll see, is starting a new government agency I think it's supposed to take effect in October, maybe the start of the fiscal year. I can't remember the full title, but it's putting together opaque parts of AID, other U.S. agencies to try and promote more U.S. development assistance. Not concessional aid per se, but the kind of financing that would help bring in private money and be able to finance development around the world. I hope this succeeds on the part of the U.S. because it would give countries a bit of an alternative to some of the other entities that are now out there, whether it's Belt and Road and others. And I know there was a lot of worry in the U.S. about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Turns out they really haven't actually committed that much lending yet. It's really a pretty small operation and, frankly, set itself up to look a lot like the World Bank. So I wouldn't consider that to be so much of a concern. Turning to foreign investment, there's a lot of interest in promoting more foreign investment. Countries want more FDI. It's to their benefit to get that real investment in, plant and equipment, create jobs, train workers, a little bit of technology transfer, maybe not, the super high-tech stuff, but at least help countries move up the development ladder. So there is a concern, though, that Chinese investment in countries is, again, comes back to the transparency issue, not so clear-cut, and perhaps doesn't adhere to the same standards that many other European, U.S., Japanese foreign investors do in countries. So this is something where, again, there could be more collective action to try and help set standards. We don't have an international global investment agency similar to, the WTO on trade, but nonetheless, there are venues, and of course the World Bank does a lot of work on this, the OECD in countries, and tries to help a lot of countries set up good investment regimes. But at the same time, countries are also undertaking more programs to try and mimic what the U.S. does in terms of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., and restrict investment in sensitive areas. Now, this is going to be less of an issue for, a developing country that really needs the investment. But when you think of the other countries in Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, certainly an increasing concern there. So again, this is something that if we work together, focus on the tech transfer. You saw in the recent Europe agreements with the Chinese that there'll be requirements on tech transfer will be lifted, but it's all very vague. We don't really know what the details are, and it doesn't seem like it's kind of a treaty commitment enforceable that would allow it to be monitored, or to give firms, the private sector, a place to go for a remedy, to try and get help. And finally, this brings me to global standards setting. A lot of the concern, I think, in U.S. industry and other places is if the U.S. is pulling back, and hopefully, Mike, you're right, that, if we have a good deal, there might be more of a harmonious moving forward on global standard setting. But I'm less optimistic on that, and I feel that since the U.S. hasn't been working closely with its allies, and if anything, we do have a lot of problems with Europe too, but if we were really to focus and feel that a lot of the standards that we've developed working through many years, whether it's been through the OECD or just very close relations between many of the advanced economies, we'd have a chance to make it more likely that China would then move towards adopting all of our standards. Now I fear that with this trade system becoming more and more disjoint and all these different groups starting, it'll be harder and harder for U.S. firms to really succeed in setting that standard. And if China really dominates in terms of foreign investment, whether it's Belt and Road or other, more advanced industries, they'll be setting standards, and that's much bigger population numbers, and then, I think the U.S. risk down the road being left out. So sorry, Mike, to be a little more pessimistic on the outlook. And I just, one of the things David said in terms of not sure about a good enforcement mechanism, this is the one thing that I've struggled with for so many years. How do you have effective enforcement? And I, too, share that worry that we're not going to have a really good way, or maybe enforcement, you don't have to use such a strong word, but some way of mechanism for holding to account, holding the parties accountable. And that's what we'll all be looking very closely at the deal. And again, will it be a bilateral treaty, actual treaty that'll go to the U.S. Congress for ratification with China? I don't think so. So again, it'll be less of a formal mechanism, and we do risk, I think, it being a bit dispersed over time. Sorry, I hope I didn't go too long.
Oh, sorry, everybody's been great on time here. And now, Brad, it's up to you to bum us right out. We've been on this downward trajectory from optimism.
I'll do what I can. First, these are my personal views, and they shouldn't be attributable to my firm. Notwithstanding, I am presuming that there is a deal that's likely. Exactly what it's going to say and how it's going to be working, of course, is all the devil in the details. But I want to start with the sort of the policy direction going forward, because I think that informs a variety of other things. I think there's been a growing consensus that the expectations were unrealistic when China joined the WTO, that they would move quickly to a market. I think there's a consensus that or a greater understanding and recognition that China is going to develop its economy based on its own self-interest. It will move in the direction of an market economy when it benefits them, and will choose not to when it doesn't. I think there's, again, more recognition that these continuous dialogues of whatever name over many years have produced uneven, at best, results, no real fundamental changes. So all that's to say that whether this administration goes on for 2 or 6 more years, I would expect trade policy at some point to deviate in tactics, but not necessarily in the fundamental concerns that China is a primary economic challenge facing the United States going forward. So a couple of few narrow points here. For example, the impacts of this dispute going forward. I think it's been obvious that companies have been concerned about their supply chains. Previously, supply chains were all about low cost, acquisition at low cost. I think companies are beginning to understand the vulnerability of extended supply chains, and especially the degree to which those chains go through China, and the degree to which they can be disrupted by policy in the United States. I think all of the Section 301 tariffs, 201 tariffs on solar products, all of these things illustrate those vulnerabilities, and companies are beginning to adjust. And it's not just an opinion. I just saw a survey result of 600 Asia-Pacific multinationals that found that 82% were changing their supply chains in response to the U.S.-China trade dispute. So it's real. It's not just sort of an impression that I think we have. One of the other things that I think is happening that I see from my perspective is that I believe companies some years ago, were in a position where they felt they understood the rules. The WTO set the framework for the obligations. They could use those obligations in talking to their governments and trying to get market access, for example. But the tariffs and such were not going to be changing dramatically for broad swaths of products. They might get better with FTA, or they might be worse with respect to an AD-CVD, an anti-dumping or countervailing duty case. But I think that's all changed. For example, now we have old laws, dormant laws, Section 301 and Section 232, which have been pulled out of the closet. And for example, Section 232 is a national security case. Well, you can make arguments as to why steel and aluminum and autos, for example, have some relationship to national security, but they certainly aren't the most pointed national security products, such as uranium, which is also a case that's ongoing right now. So I think these companies have begun to understand this and understand that they have to engage more and try to understand more about what's going on. Of course, that's a failing on my part. I can't quite tell them what's going on. But one of the things that, an additional point I would say is that there's now an expanded legal toolbox, and I think companies are beginning to understand that, and because lawyers like me are telling them that. In other words, Section 232, when it was very, very narrowly confined to national security issues, you knew that that's what it was limited in terms of its use. But the more that definition gets expanded, the more likely it gets used for things like autos, the more likely you're going to have a lot of companies asking to have that tool used for their benefit, asking for petitions to be filed. I think that goes to, an important point of all of this, which is, to me, it's somewhat ironic. You mentioned the state-owned enterprises that will likely be directly involved in the purchases, the transactional portion of the agreement that we're all sort of expecting to happen. But it's ironic to me that the very concern that we have about the Chinese government intervening in their economy is having the impact in the United States of causing additional intervention in the U.S. economy. De facto and de jure. De jure, we're seeing revisions to the CFIUS statute and other kinds of things. But de facto, you're seeing the choices about what products and which countries to impose tariffs on. And then you're seeing those choices as to which products to grant exclusions for. All of those require judgments. All of those require information, and all of them have an impact one way or the other, distortions large or small, on the economy. I think one of the, I think we've mentioned the TPP, for example, withdrawal. I think an important part of what that means for countries. We've been talking about what companies have, how companies react. I think for countries, we've got the TPP withdrawal, we've got the Iran nuclear agreement, we've got other agreements or understandings, if you will, in a general sense, that the United States is changing its mind about. And I think those have very, very long-term practical implications at the working level with diplomats, with trade people, as to can you convince someone in another country to support your idea, to support your concern with respect to, in this case in particularly, China. I think that's. I think I'll stop there and let folks have teed this up very well, and maybe we can have some good questions.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, panelists, for giving us such a rich set of ideas to chew on. And I do want to throw it open to the audience pretty soon, but I want to ask a couple of questions and invite you to engage one another as well. So Mike, you started off with a relatively optimistic reading here. And by the way, thanks for the plug. That was very nice of you.
You went to Harvard Law School. You're supposed to know these things.
I know less and less all the time. So the question I have is that how much of a problem is it for the kind of agenda that is getting closer to G2 than to Cold War 2.0 of what many people would describe as the shift in the attitude toward China in U.S. policy circles? I mean, the engagement consensus has been beat up on. There now is this kind of China as a rival, is a revisionist power. And you can trace it through some of the trade deals we've been talking about here. When the WTO, when China was getting to the WTO, it was at minimum this is going to make China a status quo rule-supporting power, and maybe it'll even change China domestically. That was part of the sales pitch to Congress. It'll make it more liberal. Then we get to the TPP, where Obama, partly for domestic political reasons, is saying this is a rivalry. Is it our rules or their rules? And now we get the Trump-era national security strategy, which is a pretty tough stance toward China, and you see it on the Hill with both parties. So can the kind of thing you're looking for navigate through those rather treacherous waters of a political souring on China?
Well, the short answer is yes. Let me give you some of President Trump's comments that help to answer your question. First of all, he has said at least twice in public fairly recently that China's goal or aspiration is to surpass the United States. And then he adds, it's not going to happen on my watch. This is a very important comment because we have a school of thought. In fact, you can do an axis, basically. If you have G2 and New Cold War on the horizontal axis, you can have a vertical axis where one pole is China is going to collapse fairly soon. You can have Pei Min-shin's very similar view, the China's Trapped Transition. That's the title of his book. A new book by Pei Min-shin is China's Crony Capitalism. So this axis is down here, that this is sort of a hopeless economy, like the bumblebee can't fly according to principles of physics. The Chinese growth rate, certainly for 30 years, a lot of economists were wrong that they can't continue this. But that group has now doubled down. They're really going to collapse soon. The other side, the high end of that pole, and by the way, you get 4 boxes when you use these two axes. The other side is China is going to do very well. Even 6% or 6.5 still may be double or triple our humble growth rate. So when you sort out these 4 boxes, strong economic growth, new Cold War, not good. Collapsing China, G2, not good. No partner, because it's collapsed. The other two look more promising. G2, strong economies, so that the difference between all other powers in the world and the US and China, the G2 world, will grow over the next 10 or 20 years. That means those who bet in that box have a much higher rate of return probability than those who bet in the opposite box of Cold War with collapsing China. That in many ways is a real nightmare. So I think the president's comments put him more in the upper left box, more toward cooperation, many, many references to President Xi as his friend, a vision in his books. He's written about China several times in books before he became president. And the vision in there of China is not a new Cold War. He speaks about good China, bad China in some detail. So if I'm correct in my interpretation of the president's many, many remarks during the campaign and transition and as president, then the criticism of him is wrong to say, oh, he doesn't want to work with our allies, or oh, he sort of hates China and he wants a new Cold War. It means anybody in Washington in the think tank who wants to get things straight has got to filter out those kind of Trump-hating remarks and focus more on the actual comments the president's made. So that said, what about the Chinese side of this? What about their assessment of us? And there was quite a wonderful document that fell into the hands of the public many years ago. A Chinese international department cadre is asked, what's China's greatest foreign policy challenge in the next 10 years? And he's asked at the National People's Congress, supposedly he has to give the correct answer. And it's a wonderful answer. Translated into English, our greatest foreign policy challenge for China in the next 10 years is managing the peaceful decline of the United States. Now, not all Chinese think this way, but he was in the party's Central Committee International Department, and actually, he's still there. I got to meet him one time and said, you really think that? He said, yes. I said, what's the worst thing that can happen? He said, well, in America's desperate moments of decline, America could turn to very hostile and even dangerous measures to try to cling to your primacy. And I certainly hope, Dr. Pillsbury, you'll do your best to moderate such hot-headed people in Washington.
Okay. Well, that should be reminded of a remark I once heard from a Chinese official. He said the challenge is to have this be like the UK to the US rather than the rise of Germany and Japan, another metaphor.
Yes, everybody's favorite metaphor.
Yes, right.
Avoid the Thucydides trap.
Right. A miniature book industry these days. So, David, I wanted to ask you about something that Brad raised in his comments, which is this notion of companies starting to relocate. So for a long time, as Brad was saying, the story always was, and you were saying as well, the story always was go cheap. And then China seemed resilient to the increasing costs of production, partly because it was reliable and nimble and all that sort of stuff. But at some point, people have raised the concern that at some point, the risk of uncertainty or the risk of high barriers are really going to start leading people to relocate, which obviously has huge implications for the region in terms that many of the countries that these production platforms would shift to would be elsewhere in Asia. So Brad's been hearing some of that from companies. Do you see that at a more kind of macroeconomic level?
Right. So in actually looking at data, the data always takes a couple years to come in. So I find this plausible that some multinationals are starting to look at this, but we don't see it in the data yet. I'm involved in a big project on global value chains with WTO, OECD, other partners. We just put out a global value chain report that's available at WTO.org. And now emphasizing this is data ending in 2017. So before we get to the trade war, the big development in recent years is the overwhelming shift of value chains to China. So 10 years ago, we could say China was a kind of an important peripheral player in value chains. And now for many, many products, China is at the heart of the value chain. So I find it plausible that there'll be some reorganization, but it's not necessarily what you're thinking. So for things that are coming to the US, it makes sense to move the final assembly to Vietnam or Bangladesh, the most labor intensive, in order to get around what are probably going to be future tariffs, right? But China, that's actually going to help China move up the value chain. And then remember, more and more of China's exports are sold elsewhere. We are just not that important in the world market. I think every country in Asia has more trade with China than with the U.S., except for Afghanistan and Bhutan, right? So we've got Afghanistan and Bhutan, and China has all the other Asian countries. And there are 50 countries in Africa that trade more with China than with the United States. So, China is more of a global trade player than the United States is. And as these value chains shift, some of that will mean trying to reduce U.S. content in value chains that are centered in China so they can export to Latin America, Africa, places like that. So I find it plausible there'll be some reorganization, but it's not going to be a simplistic reshoring to the U.S. or whole production chains are going to move from China to Southeast Asia. It's going to be some more specific pieces that get integrated, and probably, just to pick up a couple of Mike's points, China's not necessarily going to grow super fast, for the next 10 years or so. They only have to grow at about 4% to eventually overtake the United States as the biggest economy in market exchange rate terms. I wouldn't get too excited about that. I think about it that in terms of overall economy, the U.S. and China are going to be overwhelmingly the two biggest economies for the next 20 years. Everybody else is falling further and further behind. Eventually, India will catch up in 50 plus years. So think of these two big economies, and if there's ongoing political uncertainty, they will disengage a little bit, and that's what we're talking about in this specific question, Jacques. But I guess I think it's going to be costly and difficult to disengage too much.
And part of the point there is what you were making earlier, the economist's point about not worrying about bilateral trade deficits. One of the problems with trade law, of course, is this rules of origin story, which tends to treat something as coming from the last place it got on the boat. Now, there's always issues about the amount of value that has to be added in that last step, and that's been part of these trade negotiations too. But it does allow you to mask, in some sense, the Chinese content of things that are coming in and to evade those sanctions that way.
Joe, can I add one sentence
Sure,
about the president's view of bilateral trade deficits? I mean, yes, you said economists, but there is one economist who doesn't agree. He thinks bilateral trade deficits are the end of the world, and he's the president's economist, the director of trade and manufacturing policy at the White House, widely demonized, and as I understand it from Peter Navarro, he welcomes this demonization. He likes to point out that his PhD in economics is from Harvard University. And I was up there recently talking to the faculty, and they were demonizing the trade deficit view and how can President Trump say this? It's really just a function of savings. Larry Summers actually says this too. And my point is, when you're president, you get to pick which economist you listen to. And the president has said this on the campaign. It's like a campaign promise to bring down the trade deficit. So yes, maybe the most economists don't agree with Peter Navarro, despite his Harvard PhD, but the president does. So this is going to be an important part of the trade final agreement, I would think. And Meg has pointed out the consequences of that. There could be second order unintended consequences of focusing so much on the trade deficit. But I think it's a pretty big deal that the president found one economist who supports him.
But the main, just briefly, the main point I was trying to make, Mike, is, part of this negotiation with China, I think, has broad support among our partners and different parties in the United States. And on the other hand, this focus on the bilateral trade balance, yes, you can find one economist, but the vast majority of economists think it doesn't make sense. And I think the main point I was trying to make is it's almost certainly going to be unsuccessful. So it's not necessarily good politics to set up an objective that's pretty much impossible to meet.
Meg, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just going, actually, I was going to make the last point David just did, because, our trade deficit is going up. Our current account deficit is going up just because the U.S. economy is basically growing pretty well, and a lot of the rest of the world is just sort of ho-hum. We look at Europe, look at Japan, and so I would agree that our trade deficit is going to be getting worse, and so the president, I don't think, really should have hung his whole policy on the U.S. trade deficit. But also on the bilateral, the thing that always concerned me is, what about the countries the U.S. runs a current account or trade surplus with? There are actually some countries, I don't have the list right in front of me, but the U.S. runs a trade surplus with a handful of countries. Should they then turn around and try and manage bilateral trade with the U.S. to get their deficit with the U.S. down? So that's the problem when you start looking at bilateral. We'd be at the receiving end from other countries then. So, I think it's just a dangerous path to go down, and you open the door to all sorts of unpleasant retaliation and trade diverting kinds of policies that basically make us all worse off.
So one of the things that's been touched upon a little bit here, but I think has figured less prominently on this panel than in a lot of the policy debates, is the intellectual property issue. One of the major innovations of the WTO was the trade-related aspects of intellectual property obligations, and clearly front and center in the critique of Chinese behavior has been intellectual property theft, coerced transfers. If you want to do business here, you've got to license or transfer your property, or just sort of leakage and walking off. So do you think there is a risk to any trade agreement that might be reached that we will lapse back into a familiar pattern of complaining about non-enforcement of intellectual property protection now that we've entered an era where the intellectual property at stake is high-end stuff that really matters to the U.S. economy? I mean, is that a plausible pessimistic or not optimistic anyway scenario?
I mean, enforcement is always a challenge. And part of the problem with enforcement is also getting companies that are feeling the pain to actually step forward and say, you've got to do something about it, because if they let themselves be identified as complaining about something, chances are there may be other ways that they're targeted for some kind of retaliation, in terms of how they're treated in that country. That was my experience, my many years of Treasury. A lot of companies might come to us and say, oh, we really need your help with country X on this issue, but don't ever say our name, please. Well, normally when you, brought up a certain issue, the officials on the other side knew exactly which company we were talking about, because there weren't that many U.S. companies, and they knew what some of the complaints are. So that's part of the problem, too, is having, for enforcement to be effective, people have to be willing to use it and back it up and support it. And but how do you measure these things? How do you get the data? Things aren't very transparent in China, so that'll be very difficult to get enough real information that whatever kind of enforcement mechanism is there, you can actually make a fair assessment and then take remedial actions. Mm-hmm. And will the two sides agree on those remedial actions? I don't know.
So I would add that research economists are always going to try to measure things, no matter how difficult. No, so you can find international indices of intellectual property rights protection, and China is measured to be slightly better than other big emerging markets like Brazil or India. And it's also very similar to what we experienced with Taiwan and South Korea 20 years ago. So I would add that as a historical perspective. Economies like South Korea, Taiwan, they developed better intellectual property rights protection as they became innovative societies themselves, generally at a somewhat higher stage of development. China has started a series of IPR courts. They're adjudicating millions of cases among Chinese firms largely. And of course, the foreign firms feel that they're not getting a fair treatment.
But China says 70% of the decisions go in favor of the foreign company.
Yeah, and I know some cases. That worked out well. I mean, if I were like,
I'm not sure how they know that. They seem to keep tabs of.
Well, I mean, they're good at, hey, Stalinists are good at collecting information, right? Especially things that are easy to count.
I think that's also something of who brings a case. In other words, I think foreign companies bringing a case to Chinese courts more than likely are extremely well prepared. They feel that they have to have a very solid case. Now, whether they win or not, a different question, but it's more likely that they would win because they're better prepared. I would think that'd be some of the tendency for those relatively high numbers.
And one of the critiques has been that the sort of proactive enforcement has been relatively weak, so the onus is on victims of intellectual property infringement or lack of protection doing the police work essentially on it.
And Jock, the penalties are pretty minor, right?
They are quite small.
Yeah, so I just
China's offering to increase the penties.
Yeah, see, that's a really good practical.
Yeah, I mean that's true. That's true across
higher.
the board, right?
Yeah.
It's true across the board for Chinese. Sort of civil damages are low, and this has been. And in fact, the U.S. long pushed for criminalization of certain copyright infringement.
But somebody should mention that enforcement is not just a trade agreement, Court of Appeals matter. The U.S. intelligence community and the intelligence communities of our allies are going to have to do a better job as the first line of defense in detecting both the intent and the examples of violation of intellectual property and other agreements. And here it's very important to increase the budgets of FBI and others concerned to work on this. And that's why I think it's important that Nancy Pelosi, we all know, was opposed to China being admitted to the WTO. And Ambassador Lighthizer recently, I thought rather humorously, brought this up in both his House and Senate testimony that he opposed China joining the WTO for a variety of reasons, and so did Nancy Pelosi. So we have bipartisan support, Jacques, in this area of enforcement. We have a number of Democrats now. There's a letter from 7 Democrat senators, I guess you're supposed to say, to the president, essentially warning him, you're being too soft in these trade talks. We have Sherrod Brown has chastised the president for being too soft in the trade talks. Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer, as soon as President Trump said he was not going to go to 25%, as he threatened to do March 2nd, he didn't. And then there's a tweet from Senator Schumer chastising the president for being weak on China and harming American workers. So we have this interesting dynamic that our liberal Democrats are chastising the president who supposedly wanted a new Cold War and hated China. This is what the dynamic I've been trying to convey.
I guess one of the contrasts to, again, nearly 20 years ago is many of the critics of China entering the WTO and engagement are still there. The human rights critique, the labor critique.
And they've gone up in their power.
Some have, some haven't. What now you've got is
Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, again.
But you now also have much more of the Republican Party in Congress than you would have seen before, and much more of the business community who's expressing a lot more discontent. I want to throw it open to the audience. I want to ask one last question, and perhaps starting with Brad, if he wants to answer on this. You'd mentioned the national security issues that have started to come into this. Of course, that sort of started with the steel and aluminum being put in that category. But the other national security issue that's been circling around this is, of course, things like Huawei and ZTE. With the initial concerns being breaking the sanctions on North Korea and Iran, but now it's devolved into this highly political or politicized concern, 5G networks being built out and all that. So in your practice, how much is that contributing to the uncertainty that you see people worrying about in terms of trade opportunities, or is it just part of the general atmosphere of concern you've been speaking about?
I guess I'd say it's part of the general atmosphere. I think part of the confusion that might be that some are feeling, at least I'm feeling, is that previously there was an effort, and I'm sure you've felt this, to wall off criminal from trade issues. And when it was considered to be in the criminal area, then the administration stayed out and let the criminal investigators and prosecutors judge it. I'm afraid we're leaking over that line now. So things, there was some, I'll get into the ZTE issue, the president sort of wading into these issues in a transactional sort of way. I think that to me is somewhat concerning, but I think we've got, with respect to the 232, again, my expectation is there's going to be a lot of companies saying parasols that go in drinks. Now here's a national security angle as to why this case ought to go forward for these parasols.
Well, and wasn't the acquisition of Grindr just part of this concern by CFIUS? But Mike, as Brad just notes, there's the question of President Trump's weighing in on the ZTE question, and of course there was also some suggestion that the Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei, who's been detained in Canada, possibly for extradition, that there was some possibility that might be not pursued if we saw a breakthrough on a trade deal, and this has led to a lot of criticism about this blending of national security issues with trade issues and the suggestion of a more perhaps transactional connection between them. What's your take on that issue?
Well, I think from the point of view of politics and winning elections to become a senator or president of the United States, there's no artificial boundary between trade problems and criminality. It's all one big thing. And I remember the president-elect stopping the use of a term. He used it more than 20 times during the campaign. He said, China's raping our country. And this often produces 70,000 people applauding. But then it was brought to his attention, if we're going to have trade talks and continue our relationship with China in many, many areas, how do we actually operationalize your campaign promise to make China stop raping our country? And of course, it's a metaphor. It's a Chinese word that's sometimes used called zai. It means to rip off. Zai lao wai is to rip off the foreigners. There's actually a famous book in China about how to do that, cataloging all the examples. So what the president, as a campaigner, was talking about is not boundaries between trade and criminality or national security or the nuclear military balance or the new Defense Department strategy to place China really as the main threat for which our armed forces should train, should exercise, should buy new weapons. All of this is seen as one big thing when the voter goes into the voting booth. And maybe at some level, you're right, it should be separate. We should have pristine, compartments, but that isn't how the voters see it. So my own view is that this delicate balancing of the various components of U.S.-China relations are really what everybody should watch. And obviously, having accidental war or provoking an incident in the Taiwan Strait or some of the national security nightmares that could happen, that has to occupy our attention first. So when Secretary of Defense Mattis actually said in his speech, it's no longer terrorism. It's no longer Iran and North Korea. It's China. Our Undersecretary of Defense for Policy said this in a number of speeches. The Air Force's prime new weapon, it's been justified by the Air Force, is a bomber, a super stealth bomber that can penetrate what? Terrorism? Iran? North Korea? No, China. So we're starting to focus as a government, and I believe this began in the last 2 years of President Obama, actually. It's not a new innovation completely by President Trump. We're starting to focus on China as an enemy, a military enemy. And this has got to have an effect on the way we think about trade, intellectual property violations, and other things. I don't think we've gone all the way there yet, but it's certainly a much more common way of talking about China than, let's say, 10 years ago.
So I'll just do one quick follow-up before throwing it out to the audience, which is from the more economist-oriented perspective here. It's often said that countries in the region really don't want to have to choose between the U.S. and China. One of the ways you choose is how you organize your economic affairs. Do you see any signs yet of sort of reactions hedging against this possibility of Cold War 2.0?
I don't know. I think that's a good question. I mean, what I was trying to convey earlier is that there is this, and the point made about China being such an important trading partner, investment partner for all these countries. So of course they want to get along with China, but they don't want to lose the opportunities that being engaged with the U.S. presents. So I do think it's putting them a little bit in a tough spot. It's hard for me to say there's been a real shift, but what I do worry about is because of all the uncertainty that U.S. policies have added to the global decision-making process, that countries are going to be less comfortable with, let's say, relying on the U.S. or counting on the U.S. as being there. If there's some sort of agreement, will it still work in 2 years, or will there be a difference, or how do we know that it's going to be honored? And I think in the past, there wasn't that concern. If the U.S. made a deal, the U.S. made a deal, and we would carry through. So I'm a little worried that that's added so much uncertainty that it might make it easier for countries to just, all right, well, okay, China's big, it's closer, it's going to be there, so we'll do it the Chinese way.
Yeah, I mean, what I hear from Southeast Asian countries is, they don't want to have to choose between China and the United States. The Chinese are having this big Belt and Road Forum in Beijing this week, and all 10 ASEAN leaders are there. And I think, that's an example. They recognize that China is the big economic player in Asia, and they're benefiting from that, and they want to be part of that. But I note that 3 of them are also members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They wish the United States had stayed in TPP, and they wish the United States stays engaged, but they're definitely going to hedge.
Okay, well, we've got some time for questions from the audience. Let's start over here.
Yeah. Thank you. My name is...
We've got a microphone coming around, because we're webcasting, so you can speak into the microphone.
I can speak loudly. I was on the China Commission for 10 years as a...
Yeah, take the mic, please.
So take the microphone, because we're doing a recording of this.
Videotape you.
On the trade deficit, I just want to comment. Navarro and the president are not the only people trade deficits matter. Warren Buffett wrote an article in Fortune magazine in 2003, and he said the trade deficit is going to sell the country out from under us. Because when you're sending your dollars out, and they're not coming back to buy your goods, they're coming back and buying portions of our economy and our industry. So that's a phenomenon that's related to our ongoing and massive trade deficits for many years. But the issue that I think needs to be discussed and wasn't discussed today, was the role of a corporation. I was on the General Counsel of the Senate Banking Committee when I saw a movement from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism. At one time, our corporations felt they had a responsibility to our citizens, their shareholders, their customers, and the country. Now, corporations think their only responsibility is to their shareholders. And that's on the Business Roundtable. And this is, you can look at this in 1980, what the Business Roundtable said and what they say now. So the companies were incentivized to enrich their shareholders and the CEOs whose compensation is tied to that, to outsource all of this stuff to China and ship it back. When China joined the WTO, we had an $80 billion trade deficit. This year, we're going to have a $420 billion trade deficit with China. That is part and parcel of the outsourcing of production by our companies to China. So we have, and Elizabeth Warren has introduced a bill. And I hear this being discussed now in the Democratic Party, that our corporations are no longer serving the national interest the way they're operating. I think that's an important issue, and I think it needs to be discussed in this whole relationship.
Okay.
Two quick reactions. So first, Warren Buffett was talking about the overall trade deficit, and I agree with him. It's something we should worry about.
And what was it last year?
The overall, it's approaching $1 trillion. Right. But the counterpart for that is not China. China's overall balance is close to zero. It was $50 billion last year, which is nothing. So the countries with big surpluses are Germany, Netherlands, Northern Europe, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. They're all rich countries. So I agree there's a problem of imbalances between us and the other rich countries, but China's not part of that. And then the second point is that I don't want to go into a lot of detail on the shareholder versus stakeholder, but I will say we still have powerful tax incentives for our corporations to move, particularly their intellectual property rights, out of the country, vested in places like Ireland or the Caribbean islands. And we should get rid of all those tax incentives to move assets and production overseas. That I totally agree with.
Great.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
Well, there is you want to go? There is a split in the Democratic Party that is a very important split between what might be called, for lack of a better term, the globalists, and what used to be called the trade union Democrats. And President Trump, in many ways, in a book he wrote in the year 2000, when he was a Democrat, he stole the trade issue from the trade union Democrats. He began to demonize the other side, the globalists, as well as the so-called rhinos, who are sort of wrapped in together with the globalists. So this is the new coalition. The president put President Trump into office. And it sounds like you'd rather have a good Democrat, but Hillary Clinton was against the TPP. She was not. She was more of a globalist. So it sounds like I want to welcome you as a member of the Trump support team.
Okay, yes, there.
Hi, my name is Alex Hammer from the U.S. International Trade Commission. This question is for David or Meg, whoever wants to take this. But we were talking about the issue of the opening of the financial sector in China. And I'm wondering if you could comment about your views about the importance of the Chinese banking sector in all of this, given that it's controlled basically by 4 big state-owned firms who are supporting a lot of the state-owned enterprise and keeping the system sort of afloat. So in these negotiations, this was very much a topic of discussion in the WTO, in China acceding to the WTO negotiations. I was wondering what your thoughts might be on the importance of the Chinese banking sector in this round. Thank you.
You want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. I'm sure David will have something to add. But, I mean, when we were negotiating the WTO, it was a very closed system. And we were focused on getting the ability of U.S. banks to establish branches in China, and that was a lot of the negotiation. And I remember at the time being a little worried that over time, as China developed and developed their own set of regulations, that would be something that would be much more difficult to get at. And one of those things, of course, is having a few very large institutions. Now, the Chinese do say, they're well regulated, and they've agreed, they've had examinations by the IMF and World Bank, this financial sector assessment program, and basically come through as the banks are very highly capitalized. With that said, there are a lot of worries about the Chinese banking system. It's extended a lot of loans to the economy, to various firms, especially state-owned enterprises, and of course, a lot of these firms can't repay them, so they're rolled over, evergreened again and again and again, and it really squeezes credit to the private sector, the nascent private sector. So of course, they all go running to the non-banks sector, shadow banking, where they're probably paying higher rates and it's not regulated, and so the Chinese authorities try and clamp down on that. But then the economy slows down, then they liberalize a little bit more, lower reserve ratios for banks. So it's a lot of push-pull trying to reform the sector, but also provide credit to the economy and keep enough of that debt under control, managed. In the end, so much of it is internal to China. I don't see the whole system imploding. I know a lot of people, you see articles in the paper that, it's all going to fall apart. Well, the Chinese government can then just turn around and prop it back up with, with government bonds, with their own financing. So because they're not so dependent on foreign involvement in the banking financial sector, I think it's less of a concern. But it does make it much harder for foreign financial firms to compete, even though there are some promises supposedly in this deal coming through in terms of foreign money managers being able to do a bit more, maybe some other firms, but it'll be very difficult to navigate. And again, we'll see how rapid the growth is going to be. I'm not holding out for or expecting that even if financial services are part of the agreement, that we're going to see a rapid change. In part, I think because the firms will be very cautious about stepping into some of the different activities and wanting to make sure they know what's on the other side of all their transactions.
I would just add that right now foreigners have about 1% of the banking market in China, and I agree with Meg. You're not going to get radical transformation, but if that grew over a reasonable time to say 5%, 5% of a market that's doubled, that would be very, very significant growth for foreign firms. Chinese banks need more capital. Essentially, the problems Meg just described manifests itself in inadequate capital in many banks, rising non-performing loans. They're going to have a lot of medium-sized banks that have to be resolved. These are usually owned by local governments. That's a great area where they should let foreigners come in and buy some of those banks. It's going to be good for China, and it's going to be good for trade and competition. Foreigners are not going to want to compete with those big four banks you mentioned. They all have some shares traded on international stock markets. I don't think that's that big a deal, but we should also be encouraging them. They're going to need more capital, so issue more shares on international capital markets and start getting, at least more private participation in those banks.
Yes, down here. Mr. Park.
Okay, this is Taeho Park from Korea. I'm one of the speakers in the next section. I want to ask David about this China-U.S. trade deal. If this is completed, what will happen to the tariffs imposed to each other? Is it it'll be disappeared, once at the beginning, or it can be phased out over time? I want to ask you that kind of question. But another question is how this kind of cross-firing each other was felt in the U.S. economy so far, as consumers or private companies. Are they complaining about this kind of high tariffs? That's one overall question. Second thing is, also maybe David or Meg, Chinese wages are increasing. Per capita income is now over $10,000. So is there any possibility that in the future, because they are growing at the 6% annually, will become a world, the country which is providing world market rather than world factory? So we don't have to worry too much about China's, excessive surplus over time. This is my question. Thank you.
So I reiterate Mike Pillsbury's point. We don't know the details of this trade agreement. So I look at the two extremes. I cannot imagine China accepting a deal where all the tariffs stay in place. I just don't see how Xi Jinping could take that to his people. As Mike said, there has to be something in this for China. On the other hand, I guess I'd be surprised if the U.S. removed all of the tariffs, because clearly the USTR team would like to keep at least some of those in place. So the obvious compromise, I think some of those, it leads to your second question, some of those tariffs are definitely hurting the U.S. economy. It's not big enough to have, measurable macro effects, but it's definitely leading to losses in particular sectors. So the smart thing, a lot of those tariffs are on parts that are used by American companies to be more competitive. So the smart thing would be to remove the tariffs on all of the parts and components, perhaps on some of the consumer goods. It seems likely we'll get that kind of a compromise. And it was clever of the administration to keep that big, the big $200 billion of import coverage at 10%, because 10% firms can eat, whereas 25%, that's actually a lot harder. So, I think that was clever.
Yeah, there have been more indications that firms that have been squeezed, have been eating the tariffs. It's becoming more and more difficult, and they're feeling they're going to have to start passing it on. Now, do consumers or the next buyer in the supply chain, for them to connect that with tariffs on China might not be so direct. So in terms of a political impact, I'm not sure that there's much of a negative, and certainly consumers writ large in the U.S. don't connect with what they go in and buy in a store. But clearly it is impacting certain sectors, as David was pointing out. But in terms of China being a market to the world, that's already starting to happen. I mean, they are shifting over to more consumption. Certainly a lot of the, as David pointed out, most of the economies in Asia, China's their biggest trading partner, not the U.S. like it was, 20, 30 years ago. So China is just so increasingly important as a market. Look at Europe. I mean, Germany has been a huge exporter to China and very reluctant to lose any of that access. So, you see Europe making deals with China to protect that access. So, the difference is, the U.S., the kind of things we produce, agricultural goods, high tech, some range of manufacturers, a lot of it China can, likes to buy from the U.S., but also can get elsewhere. Maybe not all the high tech, but then we also have some export controls that limit their ability, the Chinese ability to buy some of those products. So, yes, China is going to be a very important market for the rest of the world for a long time to come.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, right there.
My name is Stanley Nolan. I'm from Georgetown University Business School. You spoke about intellectual property rights, but I've never quite understood all what we read and hear about the theft of technology or intellectual property. Of course, if you want to be an investor, FDI, into China, you need to have, or did in the past anyway, need to have a joint venture Chinese partner. And so there's a channel for the transmission of your intellectual property to the Chinese joint venture partner. But it doesn't seem like that is theft. It's an FDI policy that may be wrong from the U.S. standpoint, but of what constitutes Chinese technology theft?
I could give a quick answer. I think it's a mistake to focus on technology theft or intellectual property theft inside China. That's the wrong place to look. Where the more significant cases take place is in the home country. And this is part of the CFIUS reform bill that attracted such widespread bipartisan support. Dianne Feinstein was a co-sponsor on the Senate side. On the House side, it passed 400 to 4. Nothing passes anymore, 400 to 4. Why was the CFIUS reform so important to technology theft and intellectual property theft? Because of the pattern that the intelligence community has reported on in public, that very clever devices, you might say, for mechanisms are used that has led Peter Navarro to use this term economic aggression, which really gets on the Chinese nerves when you say that, because aggression is something the hegemon does, not China. But the technique, I'll give you an example. The technique is often to, first of all, do your homework. Find out what is going to be important in 10 years or more in the future, what technology you need to keep your growth rate up. And teams of scientists in China do this very impressively. One set of volumes is called Science in 2050. It's a very narrow series of techniques. Look at your suit. What makes the finishing so much better that Brioni produces it, we can't. There's thousands of opportunities like this the Chinese identify. Step 2, can we openly get it? Joint venture. Step 3, can we put pressure on to get it? And step 4, can we steal it at the source? Often Silicon Valley or the area around Boston. Can we sign agreements with universities whose professors are providing the technology concept years in advance before it becomes commercialized? You find a lot of this. I brought the update of the USTR report. You find a lot of this described in here. In Navarro's paper, you find 50 of the techniques identified. So is it all theft? No. Does it begin with looking out for what you need? Yes. Do we do this? Do most countries do this? No. The corporations are supposed to do it in their sector. We don't have the kind of, we don't even have an Academy of Science, let alone the techniques to be able to do this. So what the trade talks seem to have as part of their focus is ending or reducing this behavior, which goes by this loose term of theft. But some of it's criminal. Some of it involves violations of the Economic Espionage Act. China, by far, is the most numerous violator of the Economic Espionage Act. But also, a lot of it's legal. Who knew that we have 100 agreements between the National Science Foundation and other parts of our government to transfer for free all fresh new scientific discoveries made in America to China? We have an office in Beijing to do that. President Trump closed it. But that's a broader definition of intellectual property theft than maybe the words themselves imply. But it's back to this phrase I used earlier, 在老外, to rip off the foreigner in its largest philosophical sense.
I just add to that, as somebody who's based at a university, there's a real tension that goes on here because some of the intellectual property transfer occurs in the heads of people. People who go and work at joint ventures, work with foreign companies, work in conjunction, that stuff is in their head. And China doesn't do a great job of enforcing covenants not to compete. But it's part of building human capital. And so what you're starting to see now is this backlash against Chinese nationals working in certain research facilities, including at U.S. universities. And it's become this real tension between the goal of being open to the world and building human capital versus this concern about technology leakage or loss, where some of it is paid for by government grants and by donors who have different interests. Anyone else want to weigh in? Then we got, I think, time for one last question over here on the side.
Quickie, Todd Thurwachter of the U.S.-China Foundation for Exchange and Development, was a former commercial officer, among other places in China. And picking up on the first question and the most recent on IPR, back in the 80s and 90s under Ambassador Lord and Ambassador Lilly, we were there interviewing, going out to joint ventures where the technical people assigned from home offices of Allen Bradley and A.O. Smith and Harnischweger were all lamenting at how they were seeing their technology being ripped off. Now, there was no, on the surface, it was like China was a free market. Hey, you can negotiate with anyone with your joint venture. But they all had the Chinese government behind them enforcing the requirement that no U.S. company could get in there and negotiate a better deal on divulging less of its technology. So everyone had the same deal. So at the end of the day, they were all providing this. And their corporate headquarters were not that concerned because they didn't see the process. And so my question is, with the focus on intellectual property as appropriate, and of course there's that long tradition of having to zhuanrang for transfer any type of technology just to get it into the market, or today's cybercrime and that, we know that the U.S. companies know who the offenders are. Why not simply have focused on intellectual property, those type of companies, that type of sector only because of that claimed grievance, rather than opening up everything in agriculture, jeopardizing markets that took decades to set up? So we lose 1 or 2 seasons and the Brazilians will chop down more of the rainforest to do cheap soybeans, and then we may not get in. Why not focus it more, and why not work with our allies who all have the same problem?
Okay, quickly, because we're out of time.
I guess I would try to update a little bit about the sense in which all this is occurring. China has opened up a lot of sectors to 100% foreign investment. So your toys, your smartphones, your laptops, all things made by Foxconn, who makes for Apple, Samsung, etc., Ericsson, these are all 100% foreign-owned operations in China. They have some concerns about IP, but the way it's been described to me is that those firms expect to invent technologies at a rate such that they're always going to be ahead of the Chinese. And then this is a long-standing practice in development. I mean, once you bring your technology to, say, Vietnam, it is eventually going to diffuse out of your particular ownership. That's part of a market system operating.
Anyone else on this?
Don't forget, China denies doing this. That's really the most important thing. That's why I was teasing Meg about when you come to talks with me about what a burglar you are. China has denied all the examples in the first USTR report of March and in the update. So when you were in the embassy checking into this, I doubt you ever found a Chinese company or certainly a party member who would say, thank you very much, for bringing this intellectual property theft to our attention. Well, this will never happen again. No, China's first line of defense is this is lies and it's not true. So it's hard to overcome that.
I think one of their second follow-ups is, though, well, if this is happening, bring me more information. Who exactly is being hurt by this? And what they do then is go back to that company and squeeze them some more.
And you are starting to see some selected targeting of the obvious offenders. We'll talk about the hapless one-armed robot Tappy. This is the Huawei thefts were basically a machine that was designed to quickly test cell phones by tapping rapidly. There were some Chinese researchers working with, I think this was T-Mobile, wasn't it? And this was a crude form of intellectual property theft, actually taking the arm off the robot and walking out with it. But thank you all very much. I thank this panel for a terrific discussion, and thank you all for sitting through it.